Lone cowboy Jake McClintock had avoided a woman's touch his entire life, until cruel fate brought him face to face with a wounded Apache woman, Nailin, left for dead in the vast desert. He confronted the fury of bandits and the blind prejudices of a world that saw her only as an enemy, and him as just another lone drifter, which caused deep resentment. But one of her quiet whispers, "Let me ride with you," set off a chain of events that not only turned his world upside down, but also challenged all established notions of duty and love. Prepare for an incredible journey where the strength of spirit and compassion triumph over the cruelty of the Wild West, and justice finds a new, unexpected meaning. Subscribe, like, and watch until the end, because the resolution of this story is truly shocking, and at the end, a major takeaway awaits you, comparable to the modern world, which will teach you wisdom. The sun, the relentless luminary of the West, stood high above the desert expanses of Arizona in the stifling July of 1880. A hot wind drove clouds of dust across the scorched earth, where only rare cacti and thorny bushes tried to hold on to life. Among this desolate, harsh beauty, a lone rider moved. This was Jake the Nomad McClintock, a tall, wiry man in his mid-30s. His face, weather and lined from constant squinting at the sun, was as if carved from stone, reflecting years of wandering and hardship. Jake's eyes, the color of faded denim, were always on alert, scanning the horizon, ready to spot any danger in the endless expanses. He wore a worn leather vest, a faded blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that reliably protected him from the scorching rays. On his belt, always within reach, hung his old but faithful Colt Peacemaker, and a Winchester rifle rested in a leather scabbard on his saddle. Jake McClintock was a man who had never known a woman's touch. Since his youth, his life had been devoted to roaming the prairies, hunting, odd jobs on ranches, and avoiding any attachments. He grew up an orphan, having lost his parents to illness in early childhood, and since then his only family had been his horse, an old faithful steed named Shadow, and the endless sky above his head. He avoided towns, preferring the solitude of the desert, where it was every man for himself, and the law was more of a suggestion than a rule. He felt no hatred for people, but no special love either. Rather, he kept his distance, guarding his independence like a wild animal protecting its territory. Jake's motivation was simple: survival and freedom, to constants in his ever-changing life. That day, Jake was returning from a long hunt, his saddlebags full of jerky and hides. He was riding to his old friend, Old Ben, who in a small trading post a couple of days' ride away. Ben was probably the only person Jake could call a friend, although their communication was limited to trading goods and a few words about the weather. Shadow, accustomed to long treks, evenly placed his hooves, raising small clouds of dust. Suddenly, through the monotonous creak of the saddle leather and the faint jingle of gear, Jake caught a barely discernible sound, a rustle, unlike the whisper of the wind or the movement of animals. His eyes immediately narrowed, and his hand instinctively rested on the revolver's handle. He was ready for anything. The sound intensified, and soon Jake saw something that made him freeze. At the jagged edge of a canyon, among the red rocks, lay a young woman. Her clothing, of thin deerskin, was torn in several places, and her long black hair was scattered on the dusty ground. It was an Apache woman. Her skin, the color of copper, glistened with sweat, and her chest rose and fell heavily. On her face, despite obvious fatigue and pain, was an incredible strength of spirit. She looked at the approaching Jake warily, like a wounded she-wolf preparing for a final fight. There was no fear in her eyes, only defiance. Jake slowly dismounted, so as not to startle her. Shadow snorted, but at his master's command, remained in place. Jake noticed that the girl's leg was wounded, a cut from which blood was seeping. Beside her lay the broken pieces of a bow and several arrows. By all accounts, she was on a journey and had run into trouble. He cautiously approached her, his movements fluid, not aggressive. "You're hurt," Jake said, his voice deep and a little raspy, rarely used. He spoke in English, knowing that many tribes in the West had already learned the settlers' language. The girl didn't answer immediately. Her eyes darted over his face, his weapon, his gaze, as if trying to decipher his intentions. She was clearly weak, but her gaze did not waver. After a moment, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, with a slight accent that Jake had never heard before. "A puma attacked, but I defeated it." She gestured with her head to a small pile of stones nearby, where, covered in sand, lay a dead young puma. As if to confirm her words, deep cuts were visible on its side, clearly made by a sharp object. Jake nodded, impressed by her resilience. He saw that she was not asking for help, but merely stating a fact. In his life, he rarely met such people, especially women. He pulled a canteen of water and a piece of dried meat from his saddlebag, offering them to her. "Water, meat," he said. "You need it." The girl cautiously took the canteen, her fingers, thin and strong, trembling slightly. She took a few sips, her eyes closing in relief. Then she broke off a small piece of meat and slowly began to chew. Jake noticed how she was evaluating him every time he moved. "My name is Jake," he introduced himself, trying to be as neutral as possible. She looked at him, her gaze a little warmer. "I am Naolin, daughter of the warrior White Eagle." Her voice sounded proud, despite her vulnerable position. Naolin, a beautiful name, Jake thought. He had never before met women with such inner strength, which was evident even in her weakness. Jake noticed her trying to get up, but her wounded leg wouldn't let her. He understood that leaving her here, in the desert, would be tantamount to death. But taking her with him, that was against all his principles. He had always been alone. "You need help, Naolin," Jake said. "I can bandage your leg and take you to the nearest settlement." She shook her head, her long hair sliding over her shoulders. "My tribe is far away. I cannot wait. I must return to them. My brothers, they are waiting for me." Desperation, which she tried to hide, was in her voice. She was not just wounded, she was on a journey, and that was important. Jake thought for a moment. His path lay in a different direction, but he couldn't abandon her. It would be inhumane, even for a loner like him. His gaze fell on Shadow, then on Naolin. He saw her determination, her despair. At that moment, as he was deciding whether to violate his way of life for her sake, Naolin raised her eyes to him, and her quiet but persistent voice pierced the silence of the desert like an arrow. He never knew a woman's touch, the Apache woman whisper, her eyes, the color of the night sky, meeting his gaze, which was full of confusion. Until the Apache girl whispered, "Let me ride with you." Her words were not a plea, but an assertion, a challenge that Jake McClintock, the nomad, could not ignore. Her gaze was fixed on his eyes, as if she saw something in him that he himself did not realize. In that gaze was everything: hope, despair, defiance, and most importantly unwavering faith that he would help. Jake, who had avoided all attachments his entire life, felt something inside him stir. This moment, this fragile but so strong plea, turned his world upside down. Naolin's insistent whisper seemed to pierce Jake's very heart, disrupting years of carefully guarded solitude. He stood in the middle of the scorched desert, surrounded by red rocks, and looked into the eyes of the Apache woman, which burned with defiance mixed with vulnerability. He was the nomad, a man without attachments, and this decision went against everything he knew. But something in her gaze, in her unwavering faith, would not let him leave. "Get on," Jake said, his voice dry, but without its former harshness. He walked over to Shadow, his faithful horse, and, holding the reins with one hand, extended the other to Naolin. She did not hesitate. Despite the pain, Naolin, leaning on his strong arm, with difficulty climbed into the saddle. Her wounded leg hung awkwardly, but she made no sound. Jake sat behind her, his body, accustomed to space, now felt an unaccustomed closeness. He had never before sat so close to a woman, and it was a strange, almost frightening sensation. The smell of campfire smoke, earth, and something wild, inherent to the steppes, came from her skin. The first hours of the journey were filled with an awkward silence. Jake led Shadow along a barely visible trail, trying to avoid rocky areas that could cause Naolin pain. He felt her presence behind him, heard her breathing, and it was unaccustomed, even irritating. His trip to Ben's post was now postponed, and this caused him internal displeasure. He was a practical man, and any deviation from the plan seemed inefficient to him. But he knew, if he left her, she would die, and that thought, strangely, was unbearable. They stopped at a small ravine, where Jake found a meager water source. Dismounting, he helped Naolin carefully get off the horse. Her face was pale with fatigue, but her eyes still burned with determination. Jake pulled a small piece of clean cloth and a canteen of disinfectant, a mixture of whiskey and herbs he always carried from his bag. He sat down in front of her, his movements were confident. "It's going to sting," he warned, examining the deep cut on her shin. The wound was not too deep, but it was dirty. Naolin just nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. When Jake began to wash the wound, She flinched but did not pull her leg away. Her gaze was fixed on his hands, strong, weathered, skilled. There was no tenderness in his movements, but no cruelty either. Only concentration. He bandaged the wound with a tight cloth, trying to make the bandage as comfortable as possible. "Thank you," Nailin said quietly. Something more than simple gratitude was in her voice. Jake just nodded. He prepared a small fire and roasted the remaining jerky. They ate in silence, broken only by the crackling of wood and the chirping of cicadas. Jake felt Nailin occasionally glance at him, studying him. In her eyes, the color of the night sky, he saw something he could not explain. It was something more than just curiosity. It was a deep, penetrating observation. The next day, continuing their journey, Jake noticed clouds of dust in the distance. His hand immediately reached for the rifle. "Looks like we have company," he said, his voice tense. Nailin, whose ears were sharper than his, had already understood everything. "Bandits?" she asked, her gaze becoming hard. "Maybe," Jake replied. He saw her try to find her broken bow, but it had been left at the canyon. Disappointment flashed in her eyes. Jake, as if by intuition, took his second, spare rifle from the saddle and offered it to her. "Know how to use it?" Nailin smirked, a spark of pride flashing in her eyes. "My father taught me. I am a warrior's daughter. Don't forget." She took the rifle, her fingers accustomed to the stock. Her posture, despite her wounded leg, became straight and determined. Soon they saw them, 3 men, on battered horses, with faces that were rough and greedy. One of them, with a long beard and a scar over his eye, was clearly the leader. They noticed Jake and Nailin, and a smirk appeared on their faces. A white man and an Apache woman, and a wounded one at that easy prey. "Well, cowboy," the bearded one yelled, pulling out his revolver. "Looks like you got lost, and found yourself a girlfriend, and a redskin at that. Hand over the goods, the horse, and the girl, and we'll let you live." Jake felt anger rising in him. Not so much for himself, but for Nailin, whom these men already considered their property. He looked at Nailin, and saw in her eyes not only the pain of the insults, but also a quiet, deep sadness. "You're mistaken, bulldog," Jake said. His voice was low, but there was steel in it. "This woman saved my life, and she hasn't done you any harm." He took a step forward, his hand slowly dropping to the handle of his Colt. "If you want trouble, you'll get it." The camp fell silent. The men, who had been laughing, tensed, their hands also reaching for their weapons. They knew Bulldog's reputation, but they also knew that Jake McClintock, even alone, posed a serious threat. A heavy, oppressive tension hung in the air. Nailin, to Jake's surprise, carefully got off the horse. Her wounded leg once again ached, but she stood straight, her gaze fixed on Bulldog. "I am Nailin, daughter of the warrior White Eagle," she said. Her voice was quiet but spoke with unyielding dignity. "We do not seek to be enemies, though we will not tolerate humiliation either." The dust from the fight with the bandits had not yet settled on the scorched earth, and Jake and Nailin already continued their journey. The fresh corpse of the bearded leader, left for the vultures to devour, served as a silent testament to their shared victory. The tension between them, after the fight, was replaced by a strange, silent understanding. Jake caught himself thinking that Nailin's presence no longer caused the former irritation. Rather, it was like the presence of another warrior, reliable and sharp-witted. Nailin, sitting behind him, now felt more confident. Her body, although still weak, was less tense. The rifle Jake had given her remained in her hands, as an extension of her will. They rode in silence, only the creak of the saddle and the steady thump of Shadow's hooves breaking the desert's quiet. Jake scanned the horizon, his gaze habitually searching for water and shelter. The sun was setting, and the air, which had been scorching all day, was now becoming cooler. However, to the west, where the sky was still burning with crimson reflections, Jake noticed something alarming. The horizon became blurred, and the air began to thicken into a dark orange haze. "A storm," Nailin said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rising sound of the wind. There was no panic in her tone, just a statement of fact and a deep knowledge of nature. She, more than anyone, knew how to read the signs of the desert. Jake nodded, his jaws clenched. He knew that a storm in the desert was not just rain, it was a furious vortex of sand, capable of blinding, disorienting, and even burying a person. He sharply turned Shadow around, heading the horse towards the nearest pile of rocks, hoping to find some kind of shelter. The horse, sensing the approaching danger, snorted nervously and picked up speed. The wind was growing stronger, carrying small stones with it, which struck the leather end wood with a clatter. "We have to find shelter. Fast!" Jake yelled, his voice drowned out by the elements. Nailin pointed with her hand to a narrow crevice between two huge boulders, barely discernible in the approaching haze. "There. It's deep." Jake trusted her without hesitation. The instinct for survival, sharpened by years of solitude, told him that this woman knew the desert better than he did. Shadow, pushing his way through the strengthening wind and rising dust, barely squeezed into the crevice. It was tight inside, but they were protected from the main force of the elements. The sand, like thousands of tiny needles, struck the rocks with force, creating a piercing whistle. Visibility dropped to zero. It was almost dark inside the crevice. Jake and Nailin sat shoulder to shoulder, their clothes fluttering from the draft. Shadow, pressed against them, was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear. For a moment, Jake felt like a boy again, powerless before the might of nature. But that feeling quickly dissipated, replaced by concentration. "Hold on tight," Jake said, as a new, especially strong gust of wind hit the rocks, making them tremble. He wrapped his arm around Nailin's waist, pressing her against him so that she wouldn't fall if the rocks started to crumble. Her body, thin and strong, was almost weightless in his embrace. He felt her involuntarily press against him, and in this forced closeness, there was nothing but a mutual need for protection. But something inside Jake had changed. The touch, which he had always avoided, now became a source of warmth and, perhaps, even comfort in this raging hell. The hours dragged on slowly. The sand gradually began to clog the narrow passage, making breathing difficult. Jake, covering his face with his hand, felt the dust grinding on his teeth. Nailin, despite her wounded leg, maintained an amazing calm. She closed her eyes, her breathing became deep and even, as if she had merged with the elements, accepting them as part of herself. At some point, when the storm seemed endless, she said quietly, her voice almost inaudible, "My people believe that a storm cleanses. It takes away the old to make way for the new." Jake didn't answer, but his thoughts latched onto these words. It takes away the old to make way for the new. What did she mean? His lonely life, his habits, his perceptions of the world, all of it was old. And now next to him was Nailin, wild, strong, incomprehensible. This storm, it seemed, was not just a natural phenomenon, but also a metaphor for his own life. By dawn, the storm began to subside. The wind weakened. The sand stopped hitting with the same force. When the first rays of the sun broke through the dissipating haze, Jake saw that the entrance to the crevice was almost completely blocked by sand. They would have to dig their way out. But in his chest, despite the fatigue and the sand stuck to him, a new, unfamiliar feeling appeared. He looked at Nailin. Her eyes were open, and in them was the same calm and strength as before. "Thank you," Jake said. His voice was hoarse. He didn't know exactly what he was thanking her for. For pointing out the crevice, for her calmness, for being there. Nailin just smiled. Her lips were covered in dust, but the smile was sincere. "We survived," she replied. And in those words, there was something that made Jake feel not like a lone nomad, but a part of something bigger. Their gazes met, and in them there was neither the former weariness nor the hidden animosity. There was something else, a deep, almost intimate attraction, born in the struggle for survival. They were connected by invisible threads of shared danger and a silent understanding that words could not express. The morning after the storm was deceptively calm. The sun, as if apologizing for its yesterday's fury, gently gilded the tops of the rocks. Jake and Nailin climbed out of the sandy crevice, their clothes covered in a thin layer of dust that crunched on their teeth. Shadow, although scared, was unharmed. Jake helped Nailin clean her wound, which, to his surprise, didn't look too bad. In these days they spent together, he discovered an unaccustomed concern for her. She, in turn, allowed him this care, but without submission, rather with a silent consent born in their shared struggle. The silent attraction that had been born in the storm now hovered between them, thin as a spider's web, but palpable. They continued their journey. The landscape gradually changed, becoming less harsh, with rare sagebrush and scrawny pion trees. Jake led Shadow west, to a place where, by his calculations, there should have been a small mining camp known as Griffin's Rock. He hoped to find supplies there and, perhaps, send Nailin with some passing travelers in the direction of her tribe. This thought, although logical, for some reason caused him a strange feeling of emptiness. By midday, They saw smoke on the horizon, a sure sign of human habitation. De Griffin's rock mining camp turned out to be a cluster of several squalid huts and one, slightly more decent, saloon, cobbled together from rough boards. A dozen or so men, with faces blackened by coal dust and scorched by the sun, bustled at the mine entrances or sat on crates, having a bite to eat. Their gazes, accustomed to the harsh realities of life, were wary and suspicious. When Jake and Nailin rode into the camp, all work stopped. The men's heavy, unfriendly stares were directed at them, but not at Jake. Their eyes were fixed on Nailin, an Apache woman. In that word, in the Wild West of that time, there was as much fear as there was hatred, as much prejudice as there was pain from past clashes. Jake felt Nailin tense up behind him. Her hand again rested on the stock of the rifle. A fat, sweaty man with a red beard came out of the saloon, wearing a stained apron. This was Bill Bulldog McMurphy, the owner of the saloon and the unofficial authority of the camp. His eyes, small and mean, darted over Jake, then stopped at Nailin, and a scornful smirk appeared on his face. "Well, cowboy," a bulldog said, in a bass voice, "did you marry an Apache? Or is she just your property?" His words were filled with blatant contempt, and the men around them guffawed. Jake dismounted. His movements were slow, but each one spoke of a hidden threat. "She needs help," he said evenly, ignoring Bulldog's scornful tone. "She's hurt, and she needs to get to her tribe." "Help?" Bulldog laughed again, and his laughter was contagious to the crowd. "These redskins should be driven back to where they crawled from, or better yet sent to their Great Spirit. Maybe she took our guys' scalps last night, huh, cowboy?" At that moment, Jake felt anger rising in him, burning his insides. He had always been a man who avoided conflicts if they didn't concern him directly. But now, when Nailin was being insulted, he felt as if he himself had been insulted. He looked at Nailin, and saw in her eyes not only the pain of the insults, but also a quiet, deep sadness. "You're mistaken, Bulldog," Jake said. His voice was low, but there was steel in it. "This woman saved my life, and she hasn't done you any harm." He took a step forward, his hand slowly dropping to the handle of his Colt. "If you want problems, you'll get them." The camp fell silent. The men, who had been laughing, tensed, their hands also reaching for their weapons. They knew Bulldog's reputation, but they also knew that Jake McClintock, even alone, posed a serious threat. A heavy, oppressive tension hung in the air. Nailin, to Jake's surprise, carefully got off the horse. Her wounded leg again responded with pain, but she stood straight, her gaze fixed on Bulldog. "I am Nailin, daughter of the warrior White Eagle," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it spoke with unyielding dignity. "We do not seek to be enemies, though we will not tolerate humiliation." Her words, spoken with such pride, made some of the men in the crowd take a step back. At that moment, Jake saw not only a vulnerable woman, but a warrior capable of standing up for herself. He felt something more for her than just compassion or attraction. It was a deep, almost instinctive respect. Bulldog McMurphy, seeing that his words had not produced the desired effect, but on the contrary, had turned part of the crowd against him, backed off. He didn't want a direct confrontation with Jake, whose reputation as the nomad was not empty chatter. All right, Bulldog grumbled, raising his hands in a conciliatory gesture, but his eyes were still burning with malice. "No need for blood, just let her get out of my camp, cowboy. I don't want trouble with the Apaches." Jake nodded, not taking his hand off the revolver. "We'll leave, but first, we need supplies, and I'll pay for them." Finally, reluctantly, Bulldog sold them some food and medicine. When Jake and Nailin left the camp, they felt the stares of all the men on them, but now there was something else in them. Besides hostility, there was also respect for Jake, who was not afraid to stand up to the crowd for the woman he was riding with. In the evening, when they stopped for the night by a small stream, Nailin broke the long silence. "You protected me," she said, looking into the fire. "Why'd?" Jake, bandaging her leg, shrugged. "You were hurt, and they were wrong." That was half the truth. The other half was that he felt something for her that he had never felt for anyone else. Protecting her became as natural to him as breathing. "You are not like other white men," Nailin said quietly. "You are not afraid. And you are, just." Jake looked up at her. Her words touched him more deeply than any praise he had ever heard. He, a lone wolf, who had always avoided human contact, now suddenly felt understood. In her eyes, reflecting the campfire flames, he saw something that made his heart beat faster. It was a mutual attraction, reinforced by respect and trust, born in the dust of prejudice and the test of danger. Leaving the Griffin's rock mining camp with its poisonous prejudices behind, Jake and Nailin once again found themselves in the desert, where the only witnesses to their journey were the endless sky and the silent rocks. The air, cleansed after the storm, was fresh, and in it were the smells of dry herbs and distant pines. The daytime heat gradually gave way to a soft coolness, but in Jake's chest, next to the familiar cold of solitude, an unfamiliar warmth was now pulsating. Nailin sat behind him. Her presence had become familiar, almost natural. The wound on her leg was gradually healing, but she still leaned on Jake, her hand resting on his belt. This touch, once unaccustomed, now became comforting. He caught himself thinking that he was seeking this touch, this barely perceptible contact that spoke of the trust that had been born between them. In the evening, they stopped at the foot of a high plateau, where a small stream gushed out from under the stones, forming a cool pool. Jake, dismounting, helped Nailin. Her movements were already more confident, but her limp was still noticeable. While Jake built a fire and prepared a meager dinner from the remaining jerky, Nailin, leaning on a staff, slowly approached the water. She knelt down and began to cautiously wash her leg. Jake watched her, not taking his eyes off her. In her movements there was the grace of a wild cat, strength and fragility at the same time. "The stream is cold," Jake noted, handing her a piece of clean linen. "It's better to wash the wound with warm water." By the fire, Nailin looked up at him. Gratitude flashed in her eyes, which reflected the setting sun. She came to the fire, and Jake, without saying a word, heated water in his metal mug. He carefully, without unnecessary movements, rebandaged her leg, this time using an ointment of medicinal herbs that he always carried with him. Nailin silently watched his hands, her gaze focused, as if she was trying to memorize his every movement. After dinner, when the stars lit up over the desert, Jake noticed Nailin tense up. Her gaze was fixed on the darkness, on the shadows dancing beyond the circle of light from the fire. Jake, accustomed to trusting her instincts, immediately became alert. He pulled out his Colt, but Nailin shook her head. "Not people," she whispered quietly. "Animals, many. They are hungry." Jake listened. Through the silence of the night, he could hear barely discernible rustles, distant howls. A pack of coyotes, or, worse, wolves. They were far enough away, but their presence was palpable. Jake knew that a wounded Nailin and the smell of food could attract them. He slowly got up, the Winchester rifle resting in his hands. "We need to leave this place," Jake said. "They're too close." Nailin nodded. Despite the pain, she got up, her eyes burning with determination. Jake helped her get on Shadow. They moved away from the stream, trying to be as quiet as possible. The pack followed them, their silhouettes flickering among the bushes, their eyes burning in the darkness. Jake felt their breath on his back, their hungry howls that were getting closer and closer. "There are many of them," Nailin whispered. "They want to surround us." Jake felt adrenaline course through his veins. He was ready for a fight, but he didn't want to risk Nailin's life. He looked at the rocks surrounding them. On one of them was a small cave, barely visible in the darkness. "To the cave," Jake shouted, urging Shadow on. The horse, sensing danger, ticked up speed, its hooves scraping on the rocks. They barely managed to reach the cave when the pack, like a single organism, rushed at them. Jake, dismounting, quickly turned around. The rifle in his hands became an extension of his will. He fired several warning shots into the air to scare them off, but this only made the predators retreat for a moment. It was dark and damp inside the cave, but they were safe. Jake and Nailin pressed against the wall. Their breathing was heavy. Outside, at the entrance to the cave, the wolves howled. Their voices were full of rage and hunger. Jake felt Nailin tremble next to him, but it was not from fear, but rather from tension. "They won't leave," Nailin said quietly. "They will wait." Jake nodded. He knew she was right. Wolves were patient. They could wait for hours, or even days. He felt the surge of despair, but immediately suppressed it. He couldn't give up. Not now that Nailin was next to him. He felt her press against him more tightly, and this simple, almost instinctive movement filled him with new resolve. "We'll find a way out," Jake said. His voice was firm. "We always do." Nailin looked up at him. In her gaze, which flickered in the dim light, Jake saw something new, something deep. Not just gratitude or trust, but something more, something that went beyond their shared struggle for survival. It was an inexplicable attraction, intensified by shared fear and mutual support. In this darkness, Surrounded by howling predators, they were closer than ever before. Their hands touched, and this touch was like a spark in the darkness, promising something more. The wolves' howls outside the cave grew more and more furious, echoing with a hollow sound in the narrow stone space. Jake and Nailin, pressed against the cold wall, felt the ground tremble under the pressure of the predators that were darting at the entrance. The darkness of the cave was almost palpable. Only rare flashes of moonlight, penetrating through the cracks in the stones, gave some semblance of visibility. Jake instinctively covered Nailin with his body, ready for any fight, even if it meant certain death. In this pitch-black darkness, where every rustle seemed a threat, his hand gripped the handle of the Winchester tightly, and Nailin, despite the pain in her leg, held her revolver at the ready. "They're hungry," Nailin whispered. Her voice was tense but without panic. "And they can smell us." The smell of blood. Jake nodded. He knew that Nailin's wound, although bandaged, still gave off a faint scent that was like a magnet for predators. His mind was frantically searching for a way out. He was trapped, and he hated that feeling more than anything. But now he wasn't alone. The responsibility for Nailin, for her life, burned in him with a bright, unusual fire. The hours dragged on endlessly. The wolves did not retreat. Their howls would intensify, then die down, creating a nerve-wracking symphony of danger. Jake felt Nailin tremble next to him, but it was not from fear, but rather from the penetrating cold that was seeping into the cave. He took off his battered leather vest and put it on her shoulders. She looked at him, and gratitude flashed in her eyes. This simple action seemed to say more than any words. "We need water," Nailin said quietly. Her voice was almost inaudible. "And food." "Shadow too." Jake nodded. He knew that the water supplies they had taken with them were almost exhausted, and there was very little food left. The wolves could wait for a long time, and they didn't have that much time. He had to come up with something. His gaze slid over the walls of the cave, trying to find some kind of clue, a crack, a hidden passage. Nailin, as if reading his thoughts, pointed to a barely noticeable niche in the wall, which was hidden behind a piece of rock. There might be a passage. My people know these mountains. There are legends about hidden trails." Jake cautiously approached the niche. Pushing the piece of rock away, he saw a narrow, dark passage leading somewhere deep into the mountain. It was too tight for Shadow, but they could get through. It was a risk, but staying here was an even greater risk. "Can you walk?" Jake asked. His voice was serious. Nailin nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I am a warrior's daughter. I can." Jake, making sure that Shadow, though not without protest, could stay at the entrance to the cave, where he would be in relative safety from the wolves, turned to Nailin. He knew that horses were a valuable asset in the desert, but Nailin's life was more important to him. He couldn't abandon her. "We'll have to crawl," Jake warned, inspecting the passage. "Be careful." Stones. Nailin moved forward first. Her wounded leg caused her pain, but she did not give up. Her body moved slowly but surely. Jake followed her. His rifle was at the ready, and his hand was always ready to grab her if she stumbled. They crawled in complete darkness, orienting themselves only by touch. The walls of the cave were cold and damp, and the air was stuffy. Jake felt Nailin tense up every time he accidentally touched her. It was a strange, new sensation for him. After long minutes of crawling, when it seemed that this labyrinth would have no end, Jake saw a faint glimmer of light in the distance. Hope, thin as a spider's web, flickered in his chest. They had found a way out. Emerging from the passage, they found themselves on a small, hidden platform, surrounded by high rocks. The air here was fresh, and the stars shone overhead. There were no wolves here. There was freedom, even if it was temporary. Nailin was breathing heavily. Her face was covered in dust and sweat, but Joe burned in her eyes. "We made it out," she whispered. Her voice was full of relief. Jake nodded. He looked at Nailin. In her gaze, when it met his, he saw something more than just gratitude or the joy of salvation. He saw the deep trust she felt for him, a man she barely knew. This trust was fragile, but so strong. It broke through the years of his solitude, like a flower breaking through dry earth. At that moment, when they were alone, under the endless sky, he felt something inside him change. And it was something he had never expected and had never experienced before. Deep compassion mixed with an inexplicable attraction that grew with every danger they overcame. Waking up under the first, cool rays of the desert dawn, Jake and Nailin emerged from the cave, feeling the heaviness of the past night. The wolves, like ghosts, had disappeared, leaving only flattened grass and a disturbing trace in their memory. despair was replaced by a quiet satisfaction that they had survived again. Nailin, despite the pain in her leg, stood strong. Her gaze was clear and determined. Jake, surveying the horizon, felt something new in his heart, not just responsibility, but a deep, inexplicable attachment to this woman. He realized that her presence in his life had become not a burden, as he might have once thought, but a source of strength that he had never known. They cautiously returned for Shadow. The horse, who had spent the night in confinement, met them with a nervous snore, but quickly calmed down under Jake's gentle hand. Nailin, leaning against Shadow's side, watched this, and a faint smile appeared on her face. "We must be careful," Nailin said as they moved on. Her voice was quiet, but there was a note of seriousness in it that made Jake listen carefully. "We are approaching my people's lands, and not only them. There are many other tribes here, and soldiers." Jake nodded. He knew perfectly well that in this part of Arizona, the Apache lands were a zone of constant conflict. Army patrols, Indian raids, clashes between tribes, all of this was commonplace. For him, a loner, it had always been just part of the wild landscape. But now, with Nailin, the stakes were much higher. He had to protect her, and that became his main motivation. The landscape around them began to change. The dry, scorched desert was gradually replaced by more hilly terrain, where rare mesquite bushes and tall saguaro cacti sprouted from the ground. In the air, there was the smell of fresh earth and resin. Nailin, as if guided by an invisible thread, pointed the way. Her instincts were sharper than any maps. She knew every stone, every trail, every change in the wind. They moved cautiously, trying to avoid open spaces. Jake relied on Nailin more and more. Her sharp hearing, her ability to read tracks, her knowledge of plants and animals, all of this was invaluable in this harsh world. He learned from her, without even realizing it, and this caused something akin to admiration in him. He, who had always considered himself self-sufficient, now felt his world expanding thanks to her presence. One evening, when they stopped for the night at a small gorge, Nailin broke the long silence. She sat by the fire, looking at the dancing flames, and her face, illuminated by the fire, seemed both strong and vulnerable. "My father, White Eagle, he is a great warrior," she began. Her voice was soft, like a whisper of the wind. "He taught me to read the tracks of the wind, to listen to the earth, to understand the language of animals. He said that a true warrior is one who is not afraid of himself, who knows who he is." Jake listened to her without interrupting. It was the first time she had talked about her family, about her past. In her words, there was a deep love and respect for her father, for her traditions. "My brothers, they are also warriors," Nailin continued. "They are waiting for me. We were supposed to meet in these mountains. If I don't come, they will look for me." In her words, Jake heard not only worrying, but also a hint of possible danger for him. If her tribe found her with a white man, they might consider it a kidnapping or a hostile act. He knew about the cruelty with which Indians sometimes treated whites, and he had no illusions. But he also knew that he couldn't abandon Nailin. "I'll help you find them," Jake said. His voice was firm. "And I'll explain to them." Nailin looked at him. A mixture of surprise and a deep feeling flashed in her eyes. She did not expect such determination from him. She, the daughter of a warrior, raised in a world where whites were enemies, saw something different in him. At that moment, Jake understood that their bond had gone beyond simple survival. Something deep, inexplicable, had arisen between them, which overcame prejudices and years of solitude. The compassion he felt for her had grown into something more, into a deep attraction that grew stronger every day. He felt his heart, which had been closed off from the whole world for a long time, now slowly but surely opening up. Suddenly, just as Jake and Nailin were about to go to sleep, Shadow raised his head and neighed nervously. Jake immediately jumped up, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of his revolver. Nailin, without saying a word, took out her revolver. This time, it was not the howl of wolves, not the rustle of the wind. It was the sound of human voices, distant, but approaching. And these voices belonged to neither white people nor Apaches. It was the echo of a foreign, hidden threat that came from the depths of the desert. Jake and Nailin froze, their gazes fixed on the flickering shadows beyond their shelter. The voices were getting closer, and now Jake could distinguish them rough, low, full of malice. They were not soldiers or Indians. They were scalp hunters, bandits, prowling the desert in search of prey, whose cruelty knew no bounds. The thought that they could have met these men without Jake pierced him with a cold chill. He felt Nailin tense up beside him, her hand gripping the handle of the revolver he had given her more tightly. In her eyes, reflecting the light of the stars, there was not fear, but a fierce determination. "There are 3 of them," Nailin whispered. Her hearing was much sharper than Jake's. "They are coming with rifles." Jake nodded. 3 armed thugs were a serious opponent, especially in the confined space of the gorge. He quickly assessed the situation. He could hide and try to leave unnoticed, but that would mean abandoning Shadow, and most importantly it would mean the risk that the bandits would find them later. No, retreating was not in his rules, especially when Nailin was by his side. "I'll hold them off at the entrance," Jake said. His voice was firm. You try to climb the rocks. From there you can cover me." Nailin looked at him. Her eyes were full of protest. "Your life is no less important than mine, and I won't leave you. My leg. I won't be able to climb quickly." At that moment, Jake felt something he had never experienced. The hatred for these bandits, who threatened his new life, was mixed with a tender, almost fatherly concern for Nailin. He cupped her face with his hands. His gaze was piercing. "Listen to me, Nailin. You must survive. You'll go back to your tribe, and you'll tell them that not all white people are what they think. This is important." Pain flashed in her eyes, but also a deep understanding. She saw in him not just a protector, but a man who was ready to sacrifice himself for her. She nodded. "Use every stone, every shadow," Jake added, handing her his spare ammunition. "Be careful." Nailin, leaning on the staff, began to slowly but surely climb the narrow trail leading to the top of the rocks. Jake took up a position at the entrance to the gorge. His Winchester was at the ready. He heard approaching footsteps, a rough laugh, and his heart was filled with cold fury. These men did not deserve mercy. Soon, 3 silhouettes appeared from around the bend, dirty, battered, with greedy eyes. One of them, tall, with a sparse beard and a scar on his cheek, was the leader. "Well, old cowboy," the leader rasped, seeing Jake. "Looks like your luck has run out. Hand over the horse, the gun, and everything you have, and then we'll have some fun with you." His gaze slid over Jake, and a smirk appeared on his face. He was confident of his victory. "You've come to the wrong place," Jake said evenly, his finger resting on the trigger. "There's nothing for you here." Without waiting for a response, the leader raised his rifle, but Jake was faster. His shot rang out, accurate and sharp, hitting the bandit in the shoulder. The man howled in pain, dropping his weapon. The other 2, stunned, tried to take cover, but then a second shot rang out from above. It was Nailin. Her shot, just as accurate, took down the second bandit, who grabbed his leg. The last bandit, seeing that they were cornered from 2 sides, ran away. "Stop!" Jake yelled, but the bandit didn't stop. He ran away quickly, disappearing into the darkness. Jake walked over to the wounded bandits, kicking their weapons away with his foot. "Get out of here. If I see you again, I won't be so merciful." He tied their hands and left them, knowing that in the desert, they wouldn't last long without help. This was not cruelty, but the law of survival. When Nailin came down from the rocks, her face was pale, but her eyes burned with pride and relief. Jake walked over to her. His gaze was full of respect. "You were magnificent," he said, and genuine admiration was in his voice. Nailin smiled, and it was not just a smile, but a radiance that lit up her face. "We were magnificent." Together, they continued their journey, now under the protection of dawn. Jake felt the distance to the Apache lands shortening with every step. He understood that the moment of separation would soon come, and this thought caused him a strange pain. He, a man who had never known attachments, now did not want to let Nailin go. His heart, which he considered to be made of stone, now beat in unison with her heart. The attraction between them was undeniable, but now it had grown into a deep, almost tender compassion. By midday, they saw the smoke of campfires. It was Nailin's tribe. Jake stopped Shadow, his heart tightened with anxiety. He knew what awaited him. Nailin, noticing his hesitation, placed her hand on his shoulder. "Don't be afraid, Jake. I'll explain to them. You saved me. You are my protector." Jake looked at her. In her eyes, he saw not only confidence, but also a promise. He nodded. Together, they rode into the Apache camp. They were met by the wary gazes of warriors, directed at the white man. When Nailin, limping, jumped off Shadow and rushed into the arms of her father, White Eagle, the tension eased slightly. Nailin told them her story about the puma, about the bandits, about Jake who saved her. White Eagle, a wise warrior with a penetrating gaze, listened to her carefully, then his gaze rested on Jake. Jake stood straight, not looking away. He was ready for any outcome. White Eagle approached him. He did not say a word, only examined him carefully, as if trying to read his soul. Then he extended his hand to Jake. It was a gesture of respect. "You protected my daughter, white man. You are a true warrior." At that moment, Jake felt something he had never felt before. Not pride, not relief, but a deep, all-encompassing feeling of love. For Nailin, for her people, for this harsh land that had unexpectedly become his home. He had not just found a path to salvation, but a path to finding himself. And this liberation was sweeter than any victory. Conclusion and lesson for our viewers. Dear our grandmothers and grandfathers, you have just witnessed the amazing story of Jake the Nomad McClintock and the Apache woman Nailin. Their journey, which began with a forced trip and mutual wariness, led to a deep bond that overcame not only the desert, but also years of solitude and prejudice. In our modern life, where there is so much division, this story reminds us of an eternal truth. Love and understanding can be born in the most unexpected places and between the most different people. Like Jake and Nailin, we often face scalp hunters' prejudices, fears, and biases that prevent us from seeing the true value in another person. Perhaps someone seems foreign or different to us, and we, like Jake at the beginning of his journey, prefer to keep to ourselves. But it is precisely in the willingness to lend a helping hand, in the ability to see not only differences, but also commonalities, that true compassion and, ultimately, love are born. This story teaches us that the true richness of life is not in solitary freedom, but in the value of human connections, and that the deepest feelings, the strongest relationships can grow from the most difficult trials. Perhaps there is a Nailin or a Jake next to you, a person who seems distant, but with whom you could share a path, overcome difficulties, and find a new horizon. Don't be afraid to open up to something new, to overcome old prejudices, and to believe in the power of a sincere connection. For it is in it that we find not only salvation, but also the true meaning of life.